Welcome back to our Global Business Report here on Arise News. Nigeria is seeking to recover as much as $62 billion from international oil companies using the 2018 Supreme Court ruling the state says enables it to increase its share of income from production sharing contracts. And the proposal comes as President Muhammadu Buhari tries to bolster revenue after a drop in the output and price of oil, Nigeria's main export. It's previously targeted foreign companies, fining mobile operator MTN Group Limited almost $1 billion for failing to disconnect undocumented SIM card users, and suing firms including JP Morgan, Chase and Company in a corruption scandal. And in other news, American multinational ExxonMobil is planning to invest more than $500 million in the initial construction phase of its liquefied natural gas, or LNG, project in Mozambique. The U.S. oil company's $30 billion Rovuma LNG project, jointly operated with Italy's Eni, has a capacity of more than 50 million tons a year and is set to pump much-needed cash into the Southern African nation's ailing economy. Area 4 partners will advance midstream and upstream area to project activities of more than $500 million as initial investments. And to discuss this story, CEO Alpha African Advisory Sanyade Okoli joins me in the studio. Sanyade, good morning.
Morning, Nii.
And we're seeing the aftermath of your surgeon to Abuja on the NESD. All right, good. So what are the odds that Nigeria will be able to recover this $62 billion from international oil companies, and why? It's a proposal being put forward, but seems rather far-fetched.
So you've answered the question. Let's step back and dimension the issues. I think back end of 2017, Rivers State, Akwa Ibom and Bayelsa took the Attorney General of the Nigerian Federation to court regarding the production sharing contract. It would appear that the contracts that were signed does have a clause in there that says when the oil price goes above $20, then the government and the IOC should come back to the table to renegotiate the sharing formula. But clearly that wasn't done. In October 2018, there was a Supreme Court ruling that then came out to say that essentially the government has a responsibility to go and essentially to renegotiate the contract. But it's interesting to see this news, which is of course everywhere today, between yesterday and today, because Kachiku, the former minister, Ibe Kachiku, was quoted to have said earlier in the year that they didn't intend to go back and claw what they thought was due. Essentially, in fact, the quote used there was "what's done is done," and they were going to be looking forward. It's fair to say, if this was a 1993 contracts from the early 90s, you've had oil price above that $20 benchmark almost consistently since the late 90s. Okay. So that's over a 20-year period. It clearly isn't that simple, that it's taken us this long. First of all, it took us to 2018 to get the Supreme Court ruling, and another year since that Supreme Court ruling for the current steps being taken to have been taken.
So to a large extent, it's an uphill task, you think?
I think for the historic amount, for me, it begs the question, why wasn't this done before? If that was what the contract said, who wasn't looking? Who took their eyes off the ball? And obviously, it's successive governments that seem to have failed to address this matter. It's tricky. Definitely,
a lot of auditing will be done, and regarding that. Now, let's talk about the targeting of foreign companies for more revenues and fines. We've seen the likes of MTN and what they went through. They have their own peculiarities as well. So, is that the way to go to get more revenues? What are the likely challenges they're likely to face here?
I read this story across several different newspapers, and I must admit I am troubled that it is being seen as targeting of foreign companies.
All right.
Because that is never a good thing. Okay. The reality is, yes, the government needs revenue. I think, even at NESG and over different conversations, I think the message being given to government is, yes, we recognize that their income needs, but in seeking to generate the income that is required, it must be done delicately, so you literally don't upset the apple cart and you don't end up losing more than you have gained. So, for example, if we take FDI in 2018, Nigeria's FDI, was less than, Ghana. So we are really in a position where we need to be attracting as much capital as possible. So actually, while I was at the NESG, it was on Monday, I was facilitating a panel on investments. And there were 3 key questions we were trying to answer. One is what needs to be done to attract more domestic investment. Second is attract more foreign investment. And third is, having attracted investment, what needs to be done to ensure that they're retained and we don't have, capital flight as we've seen periodically. And one of the key, it was broken into groups, so different discussions. So the recurring themes that we all kind of know, infrastructure, rule of law, etc. But another common theme was about predictability. Without having sharp, unpredicted turns in policies, etc. Some would argue that this 62 billion is another, unpredictable big number that comes out that will frighten investors. But I guess long answer to your question is, I don't want us to see this as targeting foreigners. It shouldn't be that Nigeria is trying to milk every foreign investor, because that doesn't stand the country in good stead.
Very good. Now, you've already painted a picture of a measured approach towards all of this by government in terms of not upsetting the apple cart when it comes to the issue of the perception of targeting these foreign companies. But on the long term, what is the effect of having this scenario on this when it comes to FDIs and you're trying to at least get them to come in and invest? Because others are looking as well.
So put yourself in the position of somebody sitting in Europe, in the US, having to make an investment decision on Nigeria in any sector, and think of how you would feel when you see this news. 62 billion, it's a big number by any standards. And when you see that it goes back to 1993, what it does with all these things is just to increase the risk of doing business in Nigeria. And when you increase risk, then the returns required to make an investment viable in Nigeria increases. So you would have fewer projects that will meet the returns benchmarks for various investors.
Very good. And, we've talked about this so many times, but what other alternatives are there, instead of this, should I say, tunnel vision approach, as it were, towards this?
Well, Nia, I'd be the first to say I know that I'm quite a measured person, especially when I speak on this on this program, simply because I don't know everything. I don't know all the things that have been done. What I do know is what comes out, what's in the public view. But if I were to step back and I were in their shoes a year ago with the Supreme Court ruling, my expectation, and again, I hope this is what they did, was to call the affected IOCs. Everybody recognized, because at the end of the day, it seems like it was both parties' responsibility, both the IOCs and the government's responsibility, to come to the table to renegotiate the contract. So if that didn't happen, then one can not simply blame the IOCs alone. Governments, and as I said, successive governments, have to take some responsibility. So it's to say, okay, that's happened in the past. How can we work together to take this forward? The other thing I'll do is to be very careful about managing the communication of this issue, because unfortunately, the way the news has been presented now is quite perturbing. I think over the next few days, managing expectations and just calming fears.
Yes, you're right. It's very needed. Now, let's talk about the ExxonMobil's investment of LNG, liquefied natural gas, in Mozambique. So what's the implication for the Nigerian oil sector? More competition, as it were?
Well, off the back of what I've just said is what we hope doesn't happen. Investors who are looking at investing in Nigeria thinking, Mozambique seems to be a good option. If you look at the ease of doing business rankings for the two countries, Mozambique is about 135 versus Nigerians 146. So to your question about competition, well, certainly from global rankings, it's an easier place to do business. Having said that, when you look at across the different segments or factors that are being considered. It really is up and down. So nobody should think for any minute that you go to Mozambique and everything would be much better and everything would be much easier than in Nigeria, because it's not the case. So, for example, access to credit, Nigeria scores much better than Mozambique, and surprisingly, a lot of other countries that you wouldn't expect. But yes, you're right. You know me. You've known me long enough to know I'm always harping on about competition for capital, and we really have to. We as Nigerians, we have to factor that in and realize that at every point we need to come across as a beautiful bride. And we need to court the wonderful grooms out there.
Yeah, well, court the wonderful grooms, but still talking about that issue of the expansion and competition, as it were. We're seeing countries who ordinarily their oil sectors are still in their infancy. We're talking about Ghana, we're talking about Kenya, but we've seen a phenomenal rise in terms of their GDPs. It has grown, on account of all of this. So, and this is just like a period of 3 years, as it were, and so what's Nigeria's take on this?
Okay, so I can tell you the average Nigerian's take is, well, our GDP is much larger, which is true. They are coming from a smaller base, but not to detract from your point is that, when you address the ease of doing business issue, which, we have to give Nigeria credit that over the last few years, things have improved. Even something as simple as trying to set up a company, the CAC process, is a lot simpler. So work has been done. Another point about communication, I don't think this government has done enough to really trumpet its good work. So all we see and experience is the pain, but there has been some good stuff that has happened. So it's
I know it's a bit of a mixed grill, as it were, and just like you said, communications is key, and they need to manage the image positively. All right, Sanyade Okoli, I'd like to thank you very much for your thoughts on those issues, and keep glowing, as it were.